Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to the Texian channel. This is episode 13, The Long and Then Tragic Path to 1914. So as you can tell from the title of my channel, and from my voice and my accent, I'm a Texan. I'm an American. And the First World War, or World War I as we say over here, is not one that we remember and think about as much as we do the second, because we just didn't play as big of a role in it. Even though, after we joined in 1917, we really were instrumental in the war ending the way it did, and our soldiers actually suffered a higher rate of casualty than any other combatant group. Something a lot of Americans don't know. But anyway, we see the Second World War as being more of America's, kind of coming out party, if you will, or where we really became a world power. And the First World War is something that we don't pay quite as much attention to. And I think we should, because the First World War really is the pivot point in history. It's really when the modern world as we know it today gets born, gets created. So I'll do my best to do this justice. But my knowledge is limited to what I was able to learn in college and university and watching documentaries and studying and reading books and things like that. So if you're British or you're French or maybe you're an American who knows a lot more about the First World War than I do, then I welcome you to comment. I welcome you to help me learn and grow. So if I get something wrong or if there's something that I didn't say that should be said to help further the point, then please comment below and let me know, because I want to learn too. I want to grow. But like I said, I don't think Americans really understand this war because it wasn't fought here. We don't have monuments. We don't have battlefields that we can visit. There aren't those, large graves, war graves that are, exist in Flanders and France. The reminders of it just really aren't there for us every day, the way they are for European people. And of course, if you were European at the time, it's highly unlikely that your family escaped this thing unscathed. You probably lost somebody. And of course, if you were living in France or living in Flanders or, perhaps living in Poland or some other place like that, and really around the world where this war was fought, you might very well have lost your home, lost a family member that wasn't a soldier. But the First World War is more in the conscience, I think, of Europeans in a way that it really isn't for Americans. And that's really why I'm doing this video, these 3 videos that I'm going to do. I want to change that. I want Americans to understand what this First World War meant and how it shaped the 20th century and how it shaped European views on conflict and geopolitics and so many other things that we're still living with the consequences of today. But it was a collective trauma to me, looking at it from afar. It seems like, the entire continent suffered some sort of traumatic event. 8.5 million soldiers were killed. 8.5 million. And they're unsure about civilians. It could be we could be talking about 30 million deaths, which puts it on, I think, a pretty close par with World War II. And we look upon that as, one of the most brutal events in world history, and it was. But this isn't far from it. One of the things that I've always kind of been interested in the microcosm, or a microcosm of the First World War, was Verdun. And the strategy around that battle and what the Germans were trying to accomplish and how the French were willing to just pour man after man after man into this meat grinder. There's a road called La Rue Sacrée, which runs from Paris to Verdun. It means the sacred way, or the sacred road. And down it one way went soldiers into the fighting, and back the other way came wounded and maimed men. And there's a monument there to 150,000 plus French soldiers, that they just assume are buried in the vicinity. They don't even know. The deaths were happening so fast they couldn't keep track of it. At the Somme in 1916, the British Army lost 19,000 men killed in a day. 19,000 men in one day were lost. So it's really a pivot point in history. It's a collective trauma. It was more transformative, I think, than World War II. You look at the map of Europe before the First World War and after, and compare it to the map of Europe before World War II and after, I don't think you can really make a comparison. I think the First World War was much more transformative. Nations that hadn't existed for centuries, like Poland, were suddenly created again. Nations, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, nations like Yugoslavia, Croatia, other places were created too. And politics before and after the war were so different. I mean, you had kings and kaisers. There was a czar in Russia. There was this old aristocracy, this long tradition of European monarchy and government and rule by elites that kind of gets swept away in places like Germany and, to a much different outcome over in Russia where they had Bolshevism and communism. But Europe pivots from this very traditional, old school way of being, this old structure, this old social structure. It pivots away from that and becomes something new. And it sets the stage for World War II. It sets the stage for Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany is a creation, of course, of the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. So it transformed the continent. It transformed the world. And it's fascinating to me because the run-up to it, the years leading up to it, were a time of grandeur, a time of science and exploration. Europe had experienced the longest period of peace I think it had ever experienced. There was prosperity and peace. Science was key. New technologies were coming around, electric lighting, the telegraph. And I think there was a sense in people that the world had moved on from these petty squabbles, and we weren't going to have wars anymore because we traded with one another. And there was too much benefit to trade. There was too much benefit to these lives we were leading. How could we waste them over some petty dispute? But by the same token, Europe was kind of a tinderbox too. So it's tough to say, but I think war was the furthest thing from the minds of people in the summer of 1914. I really do. And I think if you had told a European citizen, if you told a German or a Frenchman on June the 15th of 1914, if they thought they'd be at war in August, I think they would have said no. And yet that's precisely what happened. It's kind of abrupt how the war starts too. And, obviously the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, we'll talk about that in a minute. There's a long period between that and the war starting, but even on the day that happened, the British and the German navies were doing joint exercises that day. They were both sailing around the North Sea together, working together, doing joint exercises. And of course, after the assassination, it became obvious that war was likely. So the British sailed away and they put a bunch of flags up, a signal flag that basically said, hey, we're friends. We're friends with you, the Germans. And the Germans responded that they were friends and would always be friends. And 2 years later is the Battle of Jutland, and they're blowing each other out of the water. So it's remarkable how this thing starts. And I think, really that's the question I want to answer in this video. How did this happen? How did we get to this place? And I think to do that, you have to go all the way back to the Battle of Waterloo and the Treaty of Paris in 1815. Under Napoleon, a lot of Europe had been conquered by the French. They had holdings basically from the English Channel, all the way over to Eastern Europe. And when they sat down in Paris to come up with a treaty, they had a problem. They had to figure out what to do with everything that France had conquered. Were we going to make new nations out of it? Were we going to divide the spoils up between existing nations? How was this whole thing going to work? And one of the biggest questions they had was all of these German-speaking peoples in Central Europe. And the reason was because everybody knew that if these German-speaking peoples ever unified into a single country, if they ever unified into one force, it would be a massive threat. The balance of power in Europe would shift overnight because of the scale and size that they would be. It'd be like, me and you boxing in a ring, and then suddenly Mike Tyson jumps into the ring. The fight changes at that point. So we kind of, they were thinking about this, we have to make sure that we never see that threat materialize. So what they decided to do was break all these German peoples up into small little countries. So they created little duchies, if you will, all around Central Europe. So Bavaria was one, Prussia was one, Saxony was another. There's about 14 of them, I think. And the idea was, if we keep them all separate, and we keep them from unifying together by, diplomacy or whatever it might be, then this massive force will never materialize to threaten us. And that situation held from about 1815 up until the time that Otto von Bismarck comes on the scene in Germany. And he was Prussian. But he recognized that if Germans ever unified together, if all of these duchies were ever unified into one nation, it would be an extremely powerful nation. He saw what everybody else saw. And so he began that process. He began that process and moved that forward throughout the early half of the 19th century. And I think German nationalism, I hate to use that word, but this concept of these nations unifying, which isn't something that all of them really wanted or accepted. You know, a lot of them looked at Prussia and thought, I don't want to be ruled by the Prussians. You know, I don't really want to be a part of that. That really didn't get widespread, acceptance in these German republics until the Franco-Prussian War. So in 1870, France and Prussia fight a war. And I'm not going to talk too much about that. There's plenty of videos you can go watch on the Franco-Prussian War. It's actually a very fascinating thing. The French basically get pushed all the way back to Paris. Paris is put under siege by the Germans. They end up having to sign a very humiliating peace. The outcome of it was the French thought they just didn't have enough zeal, and that's why they hadn't, won the war, and they just needed to come up with more zealous, military commanders, which of course is not the correct analysis of that. And Germany, for its part, was galvanized by this. They thought, look at this leader. Look what he's done. We've smashed the French. Look what we can do if we work together. Otto von Bismarck is key, absolutely key, in this whole process. And he's key to European politics throughout the 19th century. If there's anybody that I think should be studied in European politics in the 19th century, it's Otto von Bismarck. And his masterful diplomacy and the way that he managed the process of Germany unifying, and some of the tricks he played, some of the shenanigans he pulled to pull it off, all of that's fascinating to me. But the net effect of it was, by 1880, about a decade after the Prussians humiliate the French in the war, modern Germany is created. And you have this, the worst fears of the writers of the Treaty of Paris in 1815 is realized. Modern Germany is there. This new nation of German-speaking peoples in the center of Europe has happened. It has been created. And just like if Mike Tyson stepped into the ring, suddenly there's a tidal wave of change. And treaties start getting signed by countries that had really never signed a treaty before. France and Russia agree a treaty. And that's interesting to note because in 1854, the British and the French fought the Russians on the Crimean Peninsula. I'm cutting this video in February of 2022. Right now, Russia, or as of the recording of this video, Russia has invaded Ukraine. In 2014, they invaded Crimea. So, it's kind of funny how it comes full circle. That part of the world has always been a little bit chaotic, as we all know. But anyway, after having fought this war, suddenly the French and the Russians have a treaty agreement. Russia and Serbia have a treaty agreement. Germany, for their part, says, well, I'm not going to be left alone. I've got to sign treaties too. They signed up with the Austro-Hungarians. The Ottoman Empire joins the Austro-Hungarians in Germany, and you start to see Europe dividing into these two armed camps. You have the Central Powers, if you will, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Turks, and then you have Russia and you have France aligned. You have the Serbians there. You've got the British who've guaranteed Belgian neutrality. I mean, there's a lot going on treaty-wise here. So, all of this is happening. Europe is militarizing. It's splitting into two armed camps. It's looking for all the world like war is going to happen. But again, we have this chess piece on the board in Otto von Bismarck. And he manages, through that skillful diplomacy, to maintain the peace. He manages to keep a lid on it, even though it seems like it's going to happen at any time, and Europe is a powder keg. Bismarck is always there to tap the fires, put them out, snuff out this, snuff out that, and peace is maintained. But unfortunately, in 1898, Otto von Bismarck dies. And when he dies, the last barrier to the war happening, or maybe the peace that would have been there to snuff it out in its infancy, is gone. So the question is, why did the war start then? Was it just Otto von Bismarck dying and this, I don't know, nationalism that swept Europe? Is that what it was? I don't think so. There's a great book by Neil Ferguson. It's called The Pity of War, and if you're interested in the First World War, I'd really say read it. It's a bit heavy. It's slow going at times. It's tough. But he talks about why the war happened. And he talks about, well, was it nationalism? Well, no, not really. Was it trade? No, not really. Was it economics? No, not really. I mean, we're finding that the Germans were trading with the French more in the run-up to the war than before. I mean, that was not the problem. And his conclusion, and it's one that I share, is that it was just empires rubbing up against each other. It was Britain and France, both of whom had empires. French Indochina, right? Over there in Vietnam. And Germany, for its part, having just unified 30 years before, is also trying to get into the empire game. So they've got holdings in Africa. In fact, there was some fighting in Africa during the First World War by Germans and Brits in their colonies down there. So both of these empires are rubbing up against each other, competing for influence, competing for resources, doing what empires do, and eventually that's going to kick off into something bigger. And, that's what happened here. That's his conclusion, and I share it. I think nationalism isn't really the cause. It might have been the fuel to the fire, but it wasn't the match. It wasn't what struck it. What struck it was these empires competing with one another. And as we've seen throughout history, when that happens, when two empires are competing with each other, eventually something horrible does take place. So what was that horrible thing? What was that match that lit the fuse? Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of the Austro-Hungarian king. Now, the Austro-Hungarian king actually had two crowns. He was Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, I believe is correct, or it might be the reverse. But nonetheless, he sat on both thrones, and he had a different title. And he was last of the old school European leaders, as he would say. That's what he said to Roosevelt, our President Roosevelt, when he visited. It was something like, you see in me the last European leader of the old school. He didn't like modernity. He didn't like change. He wasn't interested in political reform. To him, what he had set up there in Austro-Hungary was perfect. But it really wasn't perfect for everybody that he was ruling over. Germany and Austria had all of the political power in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Everybody else was kind of left out. And, he was just kind of from that old school mentality. Now, his nephew, who was Franz Ferdinand, I think it was Franz Joseph was the king, Franz Ferdinand was his nephew, he didn't see things that way. He was a reformer. He genuinely wanted peace, and he wanted modernity for his empire. He saw that as really the only way he could keep it intact and keep it going. If he continued to isolate the minorities, the Serbs, the Croats, all of the other people that are in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and kept them away from power and kept it just with the Germans and Austrians, that wasn't long-term sustainable. So he was looking out for his best interest, but he saw it as really the best way to keep the empire together and give him a chance to rule peacefully if he changed the situation in Austria-Hungary. He actually had a map drawn up of how the empire could be divided up into a United States. He really wanted to give autonomy and political autonomy to all of these, little nations that had been swallowed up by the Habsburgs over the years. He gave a speech one time, and he basically stood up and said, what would we gain through war? What would we gain if we actually went and fought the Serbians like my uncle wants to do? Well, we'd end up with a bunch of goat droppings in fields and rebellious killers, and basically poo-pooed the whole idea that it just wasn't in our best interest to do that. He had a real sense of realpolitik. He understood that if the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I'm going to struggle saying that, folks, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if it was going to last long term, it had to change, and he wanted to make that change. He married a commoner, which was, not common for the time. She was not of royal blood. Her name was Sophie. I can't remember her last name now, but his uncle wanted him to marry someone of royal blood, and he refused. He married this woman that he genuinely loved. This is a good man that we're talking about here. He said that his wife was the best decision he ever made, was to marry her, that she was his whole happiness, I think is how he put it. She was his advisor, his doctor, his whole happiness. This is a good man that wants to reform, wants to make the world better, wants to lead his country, his nation, in a new and, I hate to use the term, but progressive way. He was a reformer, unlike his uncle. And it's a tragedy to me that he wasn't given the opportunity to do that. Because if he had been given the opportunity to do that, we may have avoided all of the catastrophes of the 20th century. It's really sad. So we talked a little bit about the political dynamics in Austria-Hungary. And, it was a hodgepodge of people. There was, I think it was something like 10 different languages that were spoken. German was the biggest, and then Hungarian and Czech as well. There were something like 12 different ethnicities. In fact, the British Foreign Office put together a book. It's still out there. You can read it. That basically listed all of these ethnicities and talked about the traits that made them, so that people could recognize who was who. Like if you went and traveled to Austria-Hungary at the time, you might not know who you were talking to. Was it a Serb? Was it a Croat? Was it a German? Was it an Austrian? Was it a Pole? Was it a Hungarian? And, the idea was that the people who were there on behalf of the British government, but also, British travelers could consult this. And it's incredible, the old school language that was used. Like, it was like these people, they're ignorant, but they're artistic. These people are stern, but they're, very industrious. It's really fascinating to hear how we used to look at people like that. But it goes to show just how diverse and complex a place this was. Tensions were beyond high, just beyond high. So many of these nations had been independent before they were swallowed up. Again, there's all kinds of ethnic tension. There's all kinds of grievance. Throughout the early part of the 20th century, there was rioting. There were independence movements. There was a whole host of things that were happening in Austria-Hungary at the time, all throughout the empire, that was leading to instability. And that was partially why I think Franz Ferdinand recognized the need for change, that we couldn't go on like this. This isn't going to last long term. People are just too unsettled in this whole idea. So he wanted to be a reformer. He wanted to change things. And I think with the best of intentions, he made a decision to go visit Sarajevo. Now, Sarajevo, if you see it on a map, and it might be good to go back and consult where it was in 1914, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it was literally right over the border from Serbia at the time, which was an independent country. It was heavily Serb. Now, there was other ethnicities there as well, but it was heavily Serb. And I think he chose it. He was going down there to see military maneuvers. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I think he chose that place to go because he wanted to show that he was different. He wanted the people to see him. He wanted to show that he was a reformer, that he didn't see himself as some sort of Austrian or Hungarian that was up here and you down there, you Serb. That's not the tone that he wanted to set. He wanted to change things. So, in late June the 25th actually, he and his wife, Sophie, went down to Sarajevo from Vienna to witness these military maneuvers. Now, the military maneuvers were something that Serbia wasn't happy about because, they kind of thought it might be a smokescreen for an invasion. They didn't like the idea of Austria-Hungary being down there and running these things. And June the 28th, 3 days later, the day that he was actually going to go and see these exercises, was Serb National Day. So the streets of Sarajevo were decked in flags, but they weren't Austro-Hungarian flags, they were Serbian flags. It was a sign of people saying, yes, we're in this empire, but we're actually Serbian by blood, we're Serbian by birth. So the tensions were high that day, but interestingly, the guard was light. The guard for his caravan, the guard for his entourage was very light. And I think that's because, again, he wanted to set a new tone. He didn't want to come down there and look like, a militaristic leader that was scared of these people. He wanted to go down there and say, we're all together. We're all Austro-Hungarians. We're all a part of the stream. So there weren't a lot of military guards. There were some police. It was a very unsecure situation for him to be in on a highly, highly emotionally charged day. But he wanted to set that tone. He drove slowly. He ordered that his driver move slowly through the crowd so they could see him, and he could see them. He was trying to set a new tone. He was trying to be different. And unfortunately, it ended in very tragic circumstances. So, Gavrilo Princip, he's the other chess player on the board right now. So who was he? Well, Gavrilo Princip was Serbian. He was born in a very poor rural part of Serbia. In fact, you can see the ruins of his house that he grew up in. It was destroyed in the war in the late 90s, but there's a stone there where he's carved his initials, and I think the year's 1908 or 1909, something like that. But you can actually see his initials that he carved into a stone in his house. And he grew up a fiercely nationalistic Serb. And he wanted to see Serbian people living under the Austro-Hungarian Empire be liberated and join Serbia in some sort of, pan-nationalist Serbian country, Yugoslavia or whatever the case may be. He was a freedom fighter for his day, if you will, but he was also a terrorist. He was a part of two organizations. He was part of Young Bosnia, or Young Bosnians, and an organization called the Black Hand, which was a terrorist outfit. And it was full of young people that wanted to make a difference, right? Everybody's been that age. You're very idealistic. You think you can change the world, and Princip was no different. He was a pretty young man at the time. I can't remember his exact age, but he was a very young man, and he had those same idealistic visions and patriotism and sense of wrong that a lot of people feel when they're that young. And so he wanted to make a difference, and he and his friends that were in the Black Hand wanted to make a difference too. And they thought that by committing acts of terrorism, they could make change. They could make things change. And that's really the goal of any terrorist, right? You try to commit some sort of act of violence to get a political change. Well, they were no different. So they'd been pestering. They were living in Serbia, so they'd been pestering Serbian military leaders to let them go over into Austria-Hungary and go to Sarajevo and be there to assassinate the Archduke when he comes down. And time again, the Serb officers are saying, no, we don't want to do this. I mean, we recognize how, really difficult a situation this could put us in if you go over there and do this. But they had some friends in the Serbian military, some of whom were also in the Black Hand. One of them was a man by the name of Dmitrievich. He was kind of the head of intelligence. He was the head spy for Serbia. And one of his colleagues one day walked in and said, look, I've got these young kids. They keep bothering me about going over there and doing this. I try to tell them no, but they won't leave me alone about it. So what do you think? Should we just let them go over there and do this? What are your thoughts? And Dmitrievich, for his part, he kind of felt that doing this, allowing these kids to go over there and do this might actually be a very good thing. That it suited his purposes to let them do it. And so he thought about it for a minute and he said, fine, okay, let them go. And those 4 words, that decision that he made, was the first flick of the domino. The dominoes had been lined up. They'd been lining up for, ever since 1815. But that decision that he made, to let Gavrilo Princip go that day, go across the river and try to assassinate the Archduke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, when he said that, the first domino ticked over. So what did these guys do? Well, they crossed over into Sarajevo. They set themselves up along the parade route. There were several of them. And, of course, the idea was to assassinate him. So the Archduke, driving slowly through the crowd, comes by the first assassin who throws a bomb at the car. Now, he misses. It blows up behind the car, and it wounds some police officers and some other people. And, of course, the Archduke's car races away. Now, the man who threw it was, obviously a co-conspirator with Gavrilo Princip. He was arrested and carried away. So Franz Ferdinand, of course, races away and goes to meet the mayor at basically the town hall. Now, this mayor probably didn't know that an assassination attempt had taken place. So when Franz Ferdinand arrives, he begins his, welcome speech, welcome, and says these wonderful words. And Ferdinand, who of course had just almost had himself and his wife murdered, almost had himself killed, interrupts him and is like, "Is this how you welcome your guests? I came here to, be a guest, to be a visitor, and bombs have been thrown at me. I mean, this is crazy. This is outrageous," I think is what he said. So it must have been a pretty uncomfortable moment for this poor mayor of Sarajevo, who was like, "What's even happened? I don't know." But anyway, so instead of seeing the military drills, they insisted, Sophie and Franz Ferdinand insisted on going to the hospital and seeing the people who were wounded. Again, these are really good people. That's the tragedy of this. These are good and decent people who are trying to do the right thing. And that's the first tragic turn of this whole event. Because what if they hadn't done that? What if they had been what if he had been like his uncle? What if he had that mentality? Because he might have said, "Screw these people. Pardon my French, but screw these people. I don't care about them. They're Serbs. Or they're little people down here in Sarajevo. They're not in Vienna. So I'm going to go see the military exercises." And just driven out that way. If he had done that, probably wouldn't have been assassinated that day. Now, who knows what the future would have held? I mean, maybe war would have started anyway. Who knows? But again, it's what always interests me in history. Small decisions, small happenstances, minor mistakes. These are always the things that lead to such massive consequences. It's always little things, little comedies of error that make all the difference. They were trying to be good people and it cost them their lives. So they get back in the car and they head to the hospital, but the driver of the car didn't know that they had made this decision, and so he starts to drive them towards where they should go for the military exercises, but someone says, no, that's not where we want to go. However, by that point, he had already made a wrong turn down a road. I think it was actually Franz Joseph Road, the name of named after the uncle of the Archduke. So they've made this wrong turn and they get stuck. And they get stuck out in front of a sandwich shop that was there. And as fate would have it, again, it's always the little things, it's always the odd coincidences. Inside that sandwich shop was Gavrilo Princip. He was dejected. They had thought they were going to assassinate the Archduke as he drove through the town. He must have thought, well, we failed in our mission. I'm unlikely to be able to get back to Serbia. I do have these cyanide pills that I can take. But he was probably figuring out what the heck he was going to do, how he was going to get back home. What was their next step? What was their next move? He didn't expect that he'd ever have another chance, certainly not that day. But suddenly there it was. Accident of history. A driver, uninformed of the change in itinerary, makes a wrong turn. And of course, all of the cars backed up, so it took him a while to try to get it all unwound, and while they were sitting there trying to get it unwound, Princip took his chance. And then he jumped out, and he shot the Archduke and his wife. Sophie, the wife, was hit first, and Franz Ferdinand was hit second, and again, I'm struck by how wonderful these people are and how much they loved each other. Because as his wife fell to the floor of the car, as she slid down the chair, Franz Ferdinand said to her, basically, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our kids. You have to live for our kids." It's a tragic event. We sometimes forget that these are real people with kids, and they're like us. They have the same love for children and love for family, and they're human. They're human beings with the same concerns that we have. And when they get killed, a father is killed, a husband and a wife are killed, and that's what happened this day. So what's the outcome? Well, of course, word gets back to Vienna that this has happened. And Austria-Hungary, who has been, not on the best terms with Serbia for quite some time, since that Serbia had done this. And they were right. There wasn't, overwhelming evidence, except they had arrested a Serb for it. There was no evidence to link him to the Serbian government or, to indicate that Serbia had approved his mission. Again, they had, but that evidence didn't exist. But it was enough. The Hungarian leadership sensed that this was done by Serbia. And so they convene a council. They basically decide we've got to do something about this. We have to retaliate. We have to punish Serbia for doing this. And in these weeks, in the month of July, basically, of 1914, is where the cool, steady hand of Bismarck was so sorely needed. Because this is exactly when he would have stepped in and kept a lid on all this. It would have been hard, but he was skillful enough to be able to keep a lid on all this and not let it go beyond what it had become. But the Austro-Hungarians make the decision that they're going to punish the Serbs. But they've got a bit of a problem here. Serbia is aligned with Russia, and Russia is a big country. And going to war with Serbia, invading them, would have consequences for the Austro-Hungarians. Russia would likely intervene on their behalf, or on behalf of Serbia, I should say. So this is a real problem, and Franz Joseph, the uncle, is there with his military leadership, trying to figure out what to do. They all agree that war is inevitable, that it has to happen, but Franz Joseph is worried about Russia, and he basically says, look, we've got a problem. We can't do this because the Russians will intervene, and what will we do then? And someone says to him, well, we've got the Germans on our side. We'll get backing from Germany. The Germans will have our back. And Franz Joseph kind of looks at him for a minute and says, can you be sure of that? And that's the moment the dominoes begin to fall. It was flicked when Princip was allowed to go, and they start to fall the moment that decision gets made. That's when it escalates. Germans, for their part, are contacted by the Austro-Hungarians, and they say, look, we're thinking of doing this. We're thinking of going down there and smashing the Serbians for what they did. We expect the Russians to not like that. What can we expect out of you? And the German government kind of gave a tacit, mealy-mouthed endorsement of any action. They didn't say, we'll intervene on your behalf, but they basically said, whatever you decide to do, we'll be your friend, we'll be here for you. And that was enough, that was enough to convince the Austro-Hungarians to act. And it's amazing to me, and again, this is where Bismarck would have been so essential. The German government really didn't do any diligence on what the Austro-Hungarians had in mind. They didn't ask. They didn't say, well, what was your plan? What's your long-term strategy? What are you attempting to do? What are you going to do with Serbia after you defeat them? What if you don't defeat Serbia? They just gave him a blank check. And they gave him a blank check in a very chaotic world at the time, and to people who were making very emotional decisions. This was about revenge. This was about getting them back for what they had done. Now, they might have done that, I think the Germans did, because they thought Russia would be disgusted. I think they thought that Russia would look at Serbia and, the Tsar would look at Serbia and say, that could have been me that got shot, or my son that got shot. This kind of political assassination, we can't have that. We're not going to support the Serbians. So maybe that kind of, gave the Germans an idea that Russia's really not going to do anything. They're not going to risk a war over Serbia. They realize that war will be against us. It'll be bloody. It'll be a mess. They're not going to do that. Not for these Serbs. They underestimated them. They underestimated what Russia was willing to do. And they underestimated it so much that the Kaiser actually went on vacation after all this. It's basically says, yeah, do whatever you want down there. We'll have your back. And I'm going to go off to Norway for the summer. It's amazing. It's amazing, the haphazard, lackadaisical view, and I think it stems from the fact that they hadn't had a war in a long time. And I'm not sure that the leadership in Europe at the time, because they hadn't had that catastrophe, really recognized the momentous nature of the decisions they were making. I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like you never get in a car accident, so you go out there and drive 100 miles an hour, on wet roads. They didn't understand what they were doing because they just had no frame of reference for the catastrophe that would befall them. They hadn't fought a war since the 1870s, and that was with much different equipment, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But anyway, it was just kind of haphazard how all of this happened, and sort of lackadaisical. It's really amazing. So the Austro-Hungarians, with the backing of Germany, at least they sense it, make demands of Serbia that they knew the Serbians could never accept. They were deeply insulting. And even if the Serbians had accepted it, the Austro-Hungarians wouldn't have allowed them to. Basically war was going to happen. So they hit them with these list of demands that are deeply insulting, not expecting them to ever accept them. War was going to happen no matter what. So Serbia gets this list of demands, and they ask the Russians for help. And basically saying, look, we've got this neighbor that's picking on us, and you're supposed to help. And the Russians, for their part, sensed, Austria-Hungary wouldn't be doing that on their own. They're doing this. They're bold this way because they know Germany's going to help them. That's why they're doing this. They wouldn't do this without the backing of Germany, and Russia was right to sense that. So because they sensed that Germany was in it, they thought, you know what? We've got an obligation to Serbia. If it were just the Austro-Hungarians, maybe not, but we're not going to let these Germans go down there and take on our ally. And so, Europe mobilizes. The armed camp starts to wrestle. Russia calls up the reserves, and they call them up on the same day that the Austro-Hungarians declared war on Serbia. It all happens on the same day. And it's interesting, at this moment, the leadership of Europe begins to sense that things are spiraling out of control. And all of the leaders of Europe were related to one another. Many of them were. They knew each other. They were cousins, and they had all these family connections and interconnections, and so they start to send telegrams and notices back and forth, and basically are saying things like, look, and I think they use little terms like Nicky, for the Tsar in Russia, like, Nicky, I'm not going to do this, and the King of England is saying, we're not going to take any action, we don't need to do this, and back and forth, and they're trying to get this thing stopped because it had spiraled out of control. And here again, we need Bismarck to be the one that can channel all of that in the right way to actually bring it to a conclusion. Of course, it never would have got there if he was alive anyway, but even if he had been inserted at this point, it might have been avoided. But he wasn't there, and there was no replacement for him, and the situation spiraled out of control. And again, I think the political leadership didn't understand what they were getting into. They didn't know what this was going to be. They had no frame of reference. The Kaiser, I think, when war was actually declared, when Germany actually did declare war on Russia, said something to the effect of, you will regret this, gentlemen, to his war cabinet, basically. We're going to regret doing this. And he was right. And in fact, we all regret the fact that they did it, because the 20th century and today, we're still dealing with the consequences of the war to this day. So August the 1st, Germany declares war on Russia, then France. August the 3rd, and that brings everybody into the war except Britain. Britain had no treaty obligations at the time. There really wasn't a reason to fight. Nobody had affronted them, but the geopolitical situation of the time meant that they were probably going to have to. Defending their empire against all of these powers wasn't easy to do, even in the best of times. If these other nations were on a war footing and had mobilized and were, going around the world with warships and things like that, it would have been even harder to do it and do it safely, to do it without being pulled into the war anyway. And they also had some interests on the continent. I mean, they certainly didn't want Germany having access to ports on the French coast, very similar to what happened in World War II. They didn't want to have the German Navy having the ability to sail from there. There were a lot of other things that were in it. It kind of made the British do what they needed to do to get into the war. And so on August the 4th, the following day, I think at 11 o'clock that night, Britain declares war too. And the beginning of the war, just as the geopolitical intrigue that led up to it, was odd. Some people, and we know from their writings, were downplaying it. Thought, this is no big deal, be over soon. Some thought it was going to be catastrophic. Some thought it wouldn't last very long at all. The French finance minister said that the money to pay for the war would run out in 1915. And in fact, had the United States and the U.S. banking system not loaned so much money, it very well might have. And the war very well might have ended in 1915, and a lot of lives would have been saved. And I think it's a black mark on our country that we were willing, out of greed, to fund this slaughter for as long as we did. Shameful. But that's my view, and an opinion for another video, probably. So it was a long and winding road. A long and winding road of European politics, from the Treaty of Paris all the way up to the assassination, to all of these alliances that had been formed coming good and needing to be initiated, leaders that didn't know how to keep a lid on it, didn't even seem to think it was going to be a big deal. Again, the Kaiser goes on vacation. You know, it was just a kind of a tragic comedy that led up to it. Tragic comedy of errors and emotional decision making. And the Europeans and the world would pay the price for all of that. And in fact, we're still paying it to this day. The consequences of the First World War are with us to this day. In the Middle East, in the Balkans, in America being a superpower, in communism, which, formed out of the aftermath of the war. The societal change, everything. The path led to all of that. In the next video, I'm going to talk about 1914. Why it was so bloody. Why it was such a bad conflict, or such a bad year. I'm excited about that video, because I think explaining that will help Americans understand why the war was such a traumatic event. The carnage and the haphazard way, the generals stumbling around trying to figure things out, trying to change their tactics on the fly, adjusting to new weaponry, and in really many circumstances doing a pretty good job of it. Douglas Haig gets a bad rap. I actually think he was a pretty good commander when all things are considered, and when you consider what he had to work with. But again, that's a topic for another day. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please stay tuned for the next video on 1914. It'll be episode 14, and yes, that was intentional. As always, it's my pleasure to speak to you. God bless.